today's mindful moment. Okay, ready to kind of unpack some long-held beliefs about the Civil War?
I'm ready.
We're going deep, deep into the myth of the lost cause. And you know what? This isn't just some history lesson about stuff that's, in the past.
Mm-hmm.
It's about how this myth, this narrative was carefully constructed and continues to shape how some people view this pivotal period in American history today.
It's fascinating, isn't it? You know how we often think of history as this fixed, unchangeable thing.
Right.
But the lost cause, it really is a prime example of how narratives about the past can be crafted and disseminated to, serve a purpose.
Right.
To serve an agenda.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have a really fascinating stack of sources for you today. We've got excerpts from academic works like The Myth of the Lost Cause in Civil War History, first-hand accounts from lost cause proponents like Jubal Early, and even some personal letters from figures like LaSalle Corbell Pickett, General George Pickett's widow.
Yeah, by examining these diverse perspectives, I think we can really kind of uncover the mechanics of how this narrative was built.
Right.
And understand its lasting impact.
Yeah, and you might be thinking, why should I care about a bunch of old arguments about a war that ended ages ago?
Mm-hmm.
But buckle up, because this deep dive is going to reveal how a carefully crafted narrative can actually reshape an entire nation's perception of its past.
Yeah, and that's precisely why understanding the lost cause is so crucial. It's like a powerful case study.
Yes.
In how, historical narratives are formed and how they're spread, disseminated.
Yeah.
And then ultimately how they shape our, the way we think about the world around us.
Right. So to kick things off, I think it's helpful to lay out the core tenets of the lost cause myth. This wasn't just a random collection of beliefs that kind of popped up after the war. This was a very deliberate effort to reframe the Confederacy's defeat and preserve this sense of honor in the face of a devastating loss.
Absolutely. The lost cause narrative, it emerged in the aftermath of the Civil War. It was, as a way for the South to grapple with defeat.
Right.
The dismantling of its social and economic order and the loss of its slave-based economy, of course.
And one of the most striking things we came across was this quote from Frederick Douglass in 1871. He warned that the spirit of secession is stronger today than ever. It's almost like, he kind of predicted the power this narrative would eventually have.
That's a really insightful observation from Douglass, It reveals how quickly those concerns about historical revisionism, arose, even as the nation was trying to heal and rebuild.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get specific. What are the key claims of the lost cause? What are the pillars that this narrative is built upon?
Well, I think one of the central pillars of the lost cause is this downplaying of slavery as the central cause of the war. Instead, proponents, they emphasized issues like, states' rights.
Tariffs, cultural differences between, the North and the South.
So it's an attempt to shift the focus away from the moral implications of slavery and to portray the Confederacy as fighting for this noble cause.
Precisely. The lost cause aimed to portray the South as defending its way of life, its autonomy.
Right.
Against, this idea of northern aggression.
Right. But wouldn't that contradict the accounts of, formerly enslaved people, right? I mean, how did the lost cause reconcile those discrepancies, those differences in those narratives?
Well, that's where this strategic construction of the narrative comes in.
Right.
Voices that challenged the lost cause were often marginalized or silenced.
It's starting to feel like a deliberate reframing of history, almost like a propaganda campaign in a way.
You're not far off. Lost cause proponents were very strategic in their efforts. They wrote memoirs, histories, they gave speeches, they organized veterans reunions.
Right. They even went so far as to influence the content of textbooks that were used in Southern schools.
Right.
They understood the power of education in shaping young minds.
We even have a snippet here from Jubal Early's writings, where he meticulously tries to debunk Ulysses S. Grant's military accomplishments. He spent years just painstakingly assembling evidence and writing extensively to try to reshape future interpretations of the war. It seems like a very dedicated, almost obsessive undertaking to do this, to go to such lengths.
Well, Early's relentless campaign to diminish Grant's accomplishments, it's a perfect example
Yeah.
of how the Lost Cause, attempted to rewrite military history,
Yeah.
by portraying Grant as a butcher who
Right.
relied on brute force and superior numbers that they could maintain this image of the Confederacy as morally and strategically superior, despite their defeat.
So they're trying to control the narrative, even down to the details of specific battles and commanders and how these battles were fought and who was good at it and who wasn't is really interesting. And it wasn't just veterans like Early who were pushing this narrative, right? I mean, we have other people who are involved in this effort.
Absolutely. Figures like LaSalle Pickett, she played a critical role in shaping popular perceptions of the Confederacy. She wrote books, she gave lectures, she granted interviews, all with this aim of promoting this very romanticized, this sentimental image of the Old South.
Her book, Pickett and His Men, is a fascinating read. It's written almost like a romantic novel.
Yeah.
Downplaying the horrors of war and slavery and really painting a picture of her husband and other Confederate soldiers as these chivalrous heroes.
Yeah, and it's a powerful example of how personal narratives can be used to craft a specific historical narrative
Right.
by weaving this story of chivalry and honor and noble sacrifice. She effectively obscured these darker truths of the Confederacy
Right.
and its motivations.
It makes you wonder how many other stories from that era remain, untold or distorted to, fit this narrative that they're trying to push.
Yeah, I mean, we could do a whole other deep dive into that idea.
Right, right. But if we're talking about how the Lost Cause, shaped perceptions and disseminated information, we really have to mention, the rise of these new technologies like AI and its impact on storytelling. Think about those AI narrated audiobooks, right? I mean, people are listening to these all the time now, and they present this unique challenge when it comes to historical accuracy, don't they?
You're right, and that's why channels like Mindful Moments on YouTube are so important. They offer these really insightful analyses of AI narrated audiobooks about this period, and they encourage listeners to think critically about the information they're consuming.
It's a reminder that we need to be mindful of the sources we rely on for our understanding of history.
Absolutely.
Especially with these new technologies that are constantly emerging.
Exactly. The Lost Cause narrative, it demonstrates how easily historical narratives can be manipulated.
Yeah.
Even with the best of intentions.
So we've got this narrative, right? It's downplaying slavery, it's glorifying Confederate leaders, it's romanticizing the Old South. But how did this narrative actually gain traction? How did it spread so effectively throughout the South?
That's where we'll pick up. After a short break, we'll delve into the specific tactics that were used by Lost Cause proponents and explore how they managed to embed this narrative into the very fabric of Southern society.
Oh, well, looking forward to that. We'll be back after a short break. Don't go away.
Before the break, we were talking about how strategically, how effective they were at propagating this lost cause. It really is a fascinating example of how a narrative, when it's carefully crafted and then it's spread so effectively, it can kind of take on a life of its own, right?
Yeah, it's almost like a virus in a way.
Yeah.
Right? Spreading through all these different channels and infecting the way people think about this period in American history. So how did they actually manage to do this, to embed this narrative so deeply into Southern society? I mean, what were their tactics? What did they actually do?
Well, they were incredibly effective at using every tool at their disposal. They wrote memoirs, they wrote histories, they gave countless speeches, they organized these huge veterans reunions, and they even went so far as to influence the content of textbooks that were used in Southern schools. I mean, they really understood the power of education in shaping young minds.
Yeah, it's a really long-term strategy, right? Planting these seeds early on. So it's not just about controlling the immediate narrative, but it's about influencing how future generations will understand the war.
Exactly, yeah. They were playing the long game. They wanted to make sure that the Lost Cause narrative would persist well beyond their own lifetimes, and one of the most visible ways they did this was through the construction of Confederate monuments.
Yeah, those monuments are still a hot topic today, but back then it must have seemed like a pretty straightforward way to to commemorate the war dead.
It might appear that way on the surface, but those monuments, I think they were about much more than just remembering fallen soldiers. They were really a powerful statement about who held power in the post-Reconstruction South.
So they weren't just, memorials. They were also symbols of power and a very particular interpretation of history that they were trying to push.
Precisely. And they were often erected during times of racial tension, almost like a visual reminder of white supremacy, and the lost causes, idealization of a racially stratified society.
It's a stark reminder that the lost cause wasn't just about history. It was also about power. It was about control and maintaining a certain social order in the South. And if they were influencing textbooks, did this impact higher education as well? I mean, were universities pushing this narrative too?
Absolutely. Many Southern universities and colleges were founded or restructured after the war with a very clear lost cause agenda.
Yeah, and we have, for instance, we have the case of Washington College being renamed Washington and Lee University,
right,
in honor of Robert E. Lee, who served as its president after the war.
Right. And Lee's appointment as president of Washington College, it was much more than just a symbolic gesture. This was a deliberate effort to really align the university with the values and the ideology of the lost cause. And this wasn't an isolated incident. We also see examples of, universities refusing to admit African-American students. They were prominently displaying Confederate symbols and actively promoting lost cause scholarship.
It's like this whole system was designed to perpetuate a particular worldview, that fit this narrative. But was there any pushback against this? Did everyone in the South just blindly accept the lost cause narrative?
Not at all. I think it's important to remember that the South wasn't a monolith, Even within the South, there were these internal debates and divisions about how to interpret the war and its legacies.
So there were dissenting voices.
Yes.
People who saw the flaws in this narrative that they were trying to construct.
Yes, and often those voices came from unexpected places. We have sources that, highlight the perspectives of figures who recognized, the economic and technological backwardness of the pre-war South. And they argued for a more progressive path forward, one that embraced modernization and economic diversification.
It sounds like they understood that clinging to the lost cause myth could actually, hinder progress and prevent the South from moving forward.
Exactly. They saw the lost cause as this romanticized version of the past that didn't accurately reflect the realities of the present.
Right.
And they understood that the South needed to embrace change if it wanted to thrive in this new era.
So it wasn't just a clear-cut divide between, North and South, but also internal disagreements within the South about how to move forward after the war.
Yeah.
And did those disagreements ever manifest themselves in tangible ways?
Absolutely. For example, there's a passage from Charles J. Holden's essay on the lost cause in South Carolina, and he describes how Wade Hampton, a former Confederate general and governor, initially, he enjoyed this widespread support for his lost cause rhetoric, but later he faced opposition from a surprising source, from poorer, non-elite white South Carolinians.
That's interesting. It's not the division you'd typically expect. What drove that opposition? What were they so upset about?
Well, these individuals, they were led by figures like Martin W. Gary and Pitchfork Ben Tillman, and they began to question the value of the lost cause and its focus on this glorified past. They argued that that Hampton's rhetoric ignored the very real struggles of ordinary white South Carolinians in the present.
So it was a clash between those clinging to this romanticized vision of the past and those demanding solutions for the problems of the present. It's like, stop talking about how great things used to be and let's fix what's broken now.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that the South wasn't a monolith in its embrace of the lost cause. There are these class divisions, there are political differences, and there were these competing visions for the future that sometimes clashed with the dominant narrative.
Yeah, it makes you realize that history is rarely simple or straightforward. There are always these layers of complexity, competing perspectives. But even with this internal dissent, the lost cause clearly had a significant impact on Southern society. how did this narrative actually manifest itself in everyday life?
Well, the lost cause, it went beyond just words. I mean, it permeated Southern culture, influencing everything from, monument building and memorialization practices to, literature, music, and even religious observances became this powerful force in shaping, Southern identity and memory.
Yeah, we have some really vivid descriptions of Confederate reunions, for example, where veterans would gather to reminisce about their wartime experiences and honor their fallen comrades and really reaffirm their commitment to the lost cause. It sounds like a very powerful event for those who attended.
These reunions were very carefully orchestrated rituals. They were designed to reinforce the lost cause narrative and
Yeah.
and transmit its values to younger generations. It wasn't just about remembering the past; it was about shaping the future.
Yeah, I can imagine those reunions being incredibly emotional, almost like a religious experience for those who participated.
You're right. They often were. Speeches would compare, Confederate leaders to biblical figures. Hymns were sung, prayers were offered, and you start to see this blending of the lost cause with Christian faith. It was almost as if the Confederacy itself was being, elevated to a sacred
It
cause.
sounds like they were creating a shared identity, a sense of community among those who had experienced, such a profound loss.
Exactly. These reunions, they provided a space to grieve, to heal, and really to find meaning in their sacrifices, but they also served this political purpose
Right.
by perpetuating the lost cause narrative and influencing how the war was remembered.
So it's this complex mix of personal emotion, collective memory, and political agenda all rolled into one. And how did this influence extend beyond, veterans groups? How did it impact the broader Southern population? Yeah.
That's where things get even more interesting. I mean, the lost cause didn't stay confined to veterans reunions and memorials. It seeped into everyday life. It influenced, literature. It influenced music, and the way that history was taught in schools.
So it was more than just a historical narrative. It was becoming a way of life for many in the South.
Precisely. The lost cause permeated Southern culture, becoming a lens through which, many people viewed the world, and its influence, it's still felt today.
Yeah, that's a great segue to our next section where we'll explore how the lost cause evolved in the 20th century and its impact on American society today. So
Yeah.
we've been tracing the roots of the lost cause and how it spread through the South. But as we move into the 20th century, this narrative takes some really fascinating turns. It's not a static thing, right? I mean, it doesn't just stay the same.
Not at all. The lost cause, it didn't just fade away after Reconstruction. It adapted.
Yeah.
And it evolved, and it found new ways to resonate with people even as the world around them changed, dramatically.
Yeah, it's almost like a chameleon.
Yes.
It's blending into this changing landscape.
Yeah.
So how did this narrative find its footing in a new century?
Well, one way was by hitching itself to the rising power of, mass media. Think about the iconic film Gone with the Wind, right? I mean, it captured the imaginations of millions of people, but it also presented this very romanticized and frankly distorted view of the antebellum South.
Yeah, that's a great example. I mean, Gone with the Wind was this huge cultural phenomenon. It swept the nation. It won multiple Academy Awards. But watching it now, it's striking how it downplays the horrors of slavery and it portrays enslaved people as content with their lot in life.
Yeah, the film's popularity, it really speaks to the enduring appeal of a lost cause narrative. Even as the world was moving on, it tapped into this longing, I think, for a simpler, more idyllic past. It was a kind of escapism that resonated with audiences.
So the Lost Cause wasn't just about historical arguments anymore. It was
No.
it was becoming ingrained in popular culture, shaping the way people viewed the past through these very rose-colored glasses.
Exactly. And this wasn't limited to film. Literature played a huge role too. I mean, think of Margaret Mitchell, who wrote Gone with the Wind, or Thomas Dixon Jr., who wrote The Klansman, which became the basis for the film Birth of a Nation. I mean, these were masterful storytellers who drew heavily on lost cause themes.
It's almost like the Lost Cause was woven into the fabric of American storytelling, influencing how people understood their history for generations.
Yeah.
But this narrative, it couldn't just sail through the 20th century unchallenged, could it?
You're right. It couldn't. And I think the biggest challenge came from the civil rights movement.
Right.
As African Americans fought for equality and justice, they directly confronted the lost causes, this whitewashed version of history.
Yeah, it seems like a direct clash of narratives, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the civil rights movement was all about, exposing the truth of racial injustice,
Yeah.
which directly contradicted the lost causes attempts to gloss over the realities of slavery.
It was a pivotal moment. The civil rights movement demanded that America confront its painful past. It forced a reexamination of Confederate heroes, a reassessment of the war's causes, and a recognition of just how central slavery was to the Confederacy.
And as this reassessment was unfolding, I imagine Confederate symbols like the Confederate battle flag became increasingly contentious.
Absolutely. For many, that flag wasn't just a piece of history. It represented, a system of oppression and white supremacy. And as the civil rights movement gained momentum, these symbols became, they became flashpoints for conflict and debate.
Yeah, and we see this even today, don't we? I mean, the debates over Confederate monuments, flags in public spaces, even on university campuses. These are all echoes of that same struggle over whose narrative gets to define the past.
Exactly. These debates, they're not simply about, objects or symbols. They're about the stories we tell about ourselves. They're about power, and they're about, who gets to control the historical narrative.
And as we grapple with these issues today, it's vital to understand that the lost cause, while flawed and damaging, still holds this really powerful emotional pull for some people.
You're right. That romanticized vision of the Confederacy, the nostalgia for a simpler time, the reluctance to acknowledge the true brutality of slavery, these all contribute to its continued appeal.
It's a reminder that history is not just about facts and dates. It's about emotion. It's about identity and how we make sense of the world around us.
And those emotions can be incredibly powerful. Understanding the history of the lost cause, its evolution, and its enduring legacy, it's crucial if we want to engage in these debates in a meaningful way.
So what does this all mean? It means that the lost cause isn't just a relic of the past. It's a living force. It continues to shape our understanding of history, of race, and national identity.
It's a reminder that history is never truly settled.
Right.
It's a constant process of, reinterpretation and debate. And each generation has to, grapple with these legacies.
Right. Well, thank you. That was really insightful. I think we covered a lot of ground today. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the myth of the lost cause. It's a complicated and often controversial topic, but we hope you found this exploration enlightening and thought-provoking. If you found this deep dive illuminating, we encourage you to subscribe to the show and share it with your friends. Let's keep the conversation going and explore more fascinating chapters of history together.
And if you're looking to do your own deep dive into a stack of sources, visit our website to learn more.
Thanks for listening.